Yemen, what they would mean for the different political actors, and what it might deliver for the country's politics, security, and perhaps most importantly of all, what it could deliver for the well-being of its people. The seminar will run for an hour and a half. We've got 4 contributors who will begin our deliberations, and the 4 speakers consisting of the panel are Professor Simon Mabon, Director of the SEPAD project, Nadwa Al-Dawsari, non-resident scholar at the Middle East Institute, Maysaa Shuja Al-deen, who's the non-resident fellow at the Sanaa project, Center for Strategic Studies, and Kate Nevens, who is the non-resident consultant with the Yemen Policy Center. There'll be plenty of opportunity for the large number of participants which we have today to ask questions, and I will do my best to regiment them and have them in some sort of order. So if you'd like to submit them to the Q&A box, and then I will do my best to put them to our speakers. But to begin the event, our first contributor is Professor Simon Mabon, who is Director of the SEPAD project. Professor Mabon.
Thank you very much for the kind words and the introduction. Before I start, I just wanted to say a huge thank you to Adam, Poppy, and the whole team at the Foreign Policy Centre for all of their efforts pulling together this series of events. It's very much appreciated, and we at SEPAD really couldn't wish for a better collaborator in terms of putting all these things together. So Adam, Poppy, thank you so much for all of your efforts. I just wanted to put that out there. And a huge thank you to everyone for attending. It's wonderful to be here with some scholars and people whose work I greatly admire. So I'm really looking forward to hearing what other people have to say rather than me. What I will do to start with, though, is maybe just put some flesh on the bones of ideas of power sharing broadly, and maybe sketch out the bigger picture of recent developments in Yemen. And then I'm sure that my colleagues have got some more detailed, more nuanced information, details to really elaborate on some of these broader points. But I thought it's useful, given that the series of events that we've been reflecting on, looking at Syria, looking at Lebanon, Bosnia, and now Yemen, has been on power sharing as a means of building peace. I thought it was useful just to actually reflect about what power sharing is all about. And fundamentally, it's this idea of bringing groups together, groups that have had their differences, often violent, often resulting in conflict, bringing them together and using political systems as a means of addressing those issues. There's a whole host of different approaches to understanding power sharing, from the corporate to the liberal. But within these different understandings, there are a number of fundamental principles, namely the idea of a grand coalition bringing together disparate groups that have often been in conflict with one another. Second, it contains a minority veto to try and ensure that any of the approaches, policies, processes deployed by this grand coalition don't unduly target particular communities. Third, it has a form of proportional representation as a means of trying to accurately reflect the population dynamics, the demographics of a particular community. And finally, there's this sense of autonomy, this regional autonomy that seeks to map onto the local demographics, the geography of what's happening, and to provide some form in a range of different ways, of course, of autonomy. So that's the broad sort of sketching. And in theory, there's a lot to like about power sharing, but as previous events have shown, there are a number of very serious issues that crop up when we actually try and put it into practice. And one of the other events featured the work of John Nagel, whose wonderful turn of phrase, zombie power sharing, sets up some of the real issues with regard to the failings of power sharing to actually move beyond this idea of building fences between different communal groups. But that, in the case of Yemen, is a problem that's quite a way down the line. In the case of Yemen, the idea of power sharing seeks to bring together these disparate groups that have been engaged in a conflict that's cost tens, if not hundreds of thousands of lives, and left Yemen on the brink of the world's most devastating humanitarian crisis, as some reports have labeled it. So the idea of power sharing then seems to be quite an important approach. It seems to offer a great deal of hope to those wanting to address the various grievances of the disparate groups involved in the Yemen conflict. But if we're going to even think about this, if we're thinking about power sharing, there are a number of immediate questions that crop up. Who's sharing the power, for one? Who is it that we're actually talking about when we're talking about creating this grand coalition? Is it the officially recognized government and the Houthis? Is it the officially recognized government and the Southern Transitional Council? Is it the Southern Transitional Council or the STC and the Houthis? The STC and the Ayla party? Is it the different sectarian groups? Is it the different local authorities? Is it the different tribes? Is it the different political parties? Is it the various civil society movements that are operating across Yemen? Who is it that we should actually be including in these discussions about a grand coalition? Broadly speaking, there's 5 main areas that have emerged in Yemen, controlled by these different groups: the Houthis, the government, the STC, the Joint Resistance Forces, and then local authorities. And underpinning that, there's 333 different local governorates, different tribal groups, different political parties, different civil society movements. So how we actually get to a point where there is conflict to a broader power sharing agreement between these different groups seems to be incredibly challenging. We've also then got other types of issues, practical issues, over the apparent absence of a state. The Yemeni state has been declared missing in action by some. It's failed to take care of its people. It's seemingly fragmented under the various pressures from above and below, struggling to actually meet the basic needs of its own people. Of course, regional actors have a huge role to play here. They've exerted a great deal of influence, the likes of Saudi Arabia, Iran, the UAE, the US, and the UK. So that in turn puts a great deal of pressure on these different actors themselves because of their transnational, international relationships. So there's a whole host of different pressures starting to emerge here. And these are exacerbated by economic factors, political tensions, territorial tensions, religious tensions. And that point about religion really comes to the fore with the construction of sect-based divisions, the sectarianization of the conflict, the bringing to the fore of sectarianism and sect-based tensions between different groups as a real driving force in the conflict, which wasn't necessarily there before. Whilst religious identities and sect-based difference was a prominent feature of Yemeni life, it wasn't the driving force of the conflict. But now it's taken on an incredibly important role. And once that sectarian genie is out of the proverbial bottle, then it's difficult to get it back in. Once sectarianization has taken place, it's difficult to de-sectarianize. That's something that we in SEPAD are trying to look at, the various processes that can be applied to facilitate a form of de-sectarianization. So you've got all of these different things going on. You've got the United Nations that's trying to advocate a ceasefire in an attempt to bring about a power sharing agreement. But the UN Security Council Resolution 2216, which is the mechanism through which a number of these things are taking place, still calls for a Houthi surrender. It doesn't adequately reflect the facts on the ground. The STC is missing, tribal groups are missing, local authorities aren't adequately represented. Neither are political parties and civil society actors. So there's a great deal that's missed either locally or by the international community's response to this. And if I may, Nadwa has written a wonderful piece recently for the Middle East Institute that acknowledges a number of these problems, and even perhaps rejects the premise of power sharing more broadly. And apologies if I'm taking your argument a little bit further than perhaps you did, but perhaps even rejecting the idea of power sharing as a solution to the Yemeni conflict, as a Western imposition. And that's, I think, something very important and something that must be reflected on. But I think the idea of power sharing is one that perhaps is useful in that it offers a framework in which people can operate together. What happens after that, of course, is incredibly difficult, and preventing the descent into a zombie power sharing mess as of Lebanon and elsewhere is incredibly difficult. And actually getting to the point where people can agree to work together is incredibly challenging. Getting different groups to give up on their maximist demands is incredibly difficult when those demands are so fundamental to their very essence. So you've got a lot of challenges. Trying to find a way that brings all these different actors together without creating space for spoilers to dismantle the project or to privilege one group over the other is incredibly difficult, let alone actually facilitating a means of governing that allows all these different actors to have space. We had an event just before Christmas where we were speaking about peace building in Yemen. And one of the more interesting ideas was one that advocated a ground up local institutions working with one another and then sort of building from the bottom rather than top down. And it strikes me that that might be the way to go, rather than a top down approach, a bottom up approach. But that still will require people working together, different groups that have long been opposed to one another, working together. And finding ways of doing that, I think, is perhaps the biggest challenge for the international community, if the international community has a role to play, but also for Yemenis themselves. And I think that's where I'll leave it. Thank you very much.
Well, thanks so much indeed, Simon. I think you've set out the difficulties and complexities extremely well. I thought it was a daunting task before us, before you spoke. I'm even more convinced now it's far more daunting than even I thought. But you referred to Nadwa, and I think Nadwa is the next speaker. So if you'd like to speak for about 7, 8, 9 minutes, that'd be great. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much for having me. And thank you, Simon, for the great introduction. And you're absolutely right. I do reject the power share agreement that's been discussed now. I call it political settlement. And that's not only because it's not inclusive enough of all the groups that you've articulated very well, but the question is Yemen ready for a political settlement? Is Yemen ready for power share as it is now? But before going on to that, I just want to say one thing. One very important point is that Yemen conflict is not sectarian, although there are elements of sectarianism are evolving, and if the conflict prolong, longer, it might become a real issue in the future. So my first advice is it would be a mistake to think about Yemen conflict or solutions for that matter for the conflict through a sectarian lens. The problem is not sectarian identities, but the power dynamics. And here I want to take this opportunity to show how the international community, the UN and the international community have not only failed to help Yemen, but how the power sharing agendas that the UN and international community have adopted not only did not help Yemen, but also made the conflict much worse. And let me go back to 2011, when the Arab Spring happened and Yemenis rallied in the street demanding the removal of former President Ali Abdullah Saleh. What happened then is that the international community intervened. And there was the Gulf Cooperation Council initiative, which is the GCC initiative. It's brokered by the Saudis, but it was largely, backed by the US, UK, and the international community. So now that initiative was deeply flawed. And it was deeply flawed because, again, it focused on the political elite at the national level. It focused on the power struggle among the political elite at the national level, but it failed to understand, it failed to address the grievances that led to the Arab Spring and the protests. And that's been a pattern that we have seen with basically all adopted and advocated for power sharing agreements. So back to the GCC initiative in 2011, Again, it was deeply flawed because one, it granted former President Saleh immunity from prosecution, but he remained in control of most of the armed forces. It proposed, it mandated a power share, a government that shared power 50%, 50% for the former ruling party and opposition. So it was more like a recycle of the same corrupt political elite, but the demands of the youth were not addressed. So instead of focusing on the underlying causes of the conflict, that initiative focused on the political elite and the power dynamics. The transition government was caught in fierce competition among the political elite. It failed to deliver. Saleh, who still had control over most of the military and security forces and was bitter because he was pushed out of power through that transition deal, he allied with the Houthi rebels and they staged a coup and took over the capital city of Sanaa in 2014 and then dragged the entire country into a civil war. So the GCC initiative, or the power share, created conditions that led us straight to the war. But it didn't end there. I want to talk about the current UN peace process, of UN-led negotiations. I really hate to call it peace process because it doesn't really have, and I'm not judging the intentions. I like to call it UN-led peace, UN-led negotiations, which started in 2014, basically. But I'll try to be brief because I don't have much time. So the current UN-led process that's led by Martin Griffith is also deeply flawed. It has not worked. It's not going to work. And why? Again, because it's too fixated on a power share between the Houthis and Hadi government. Again, as Simon explained, it does not include all these different forces that have legitimacy and influence on the ground, probably more than both the Houthis and the Hadi government. So it also, more importantly, it also fails to account for the power dynamics and the military situation on the ground. It basically offers very simplistic solutions for an extremely complex conflict. So a power share agreement under the current circumstances is not going to solve Yemen conflict because of one thing. If you look at the situation on the ground, the Houthis control 70% of the population, but they have the upper hand militarily. And while the UN and the international community have successfully in the past and can put pressure on the Saudis and Hadi's government to force them to de-escalate several times, and it happened, it forced them to de-escalate several times, the international community does not have that kind of leverage on the Houthis. And the Houthis are not willing to de-escalate. In fact, it's the opposite. So if, diplomacy cannot work if you don't have leverage, especially if that side that you don't have leverage on is unwilling to cooperate. And I'll go to one mistake, the Stockholm Agreement that was brokered by the UN envoy in December 2018. It was meant to, one, prevent government forces from retaking the Hodeidah seaport from Houthis, but two, prepare for power share. So what happened? So the Saudis and the government stopped the military offensive at Hodeidah, but the Houthis, what they did, they exploited that ceasefire and they regrouped and they took all their forces and made substantial military gains since 2018. And now they're threatening Marib city, which is the last stronghold of the government, has been a stable zone, a pocket of stability, but also it has 3 million civilians. And so it actually, so what the Stockholm Agreement did, inadvertently, it played into the hands of the Houthis. It tipped the military balance in their favor. It allowed them to expand and make substantial military gains. And I think the same thing will happen now. And now people are talking, the US have appointed an envoy. Martin Griffith has been working really hard trying to get the Saudis to agree with the Houthis and political settlement and all of that. And I appreciate all these efforts. But at the same time, again, it's disconnected from the reality because the Houthis have expanded militarily. They are de-escalating. They're not willing to de-escalate. They're not listening to any calls for de-escalation. But at the same time, this is a group that does not recognize any Yemeni actor. They define the conflict as it's between them and Saudi Arabia. All other actors to them, including the government of Yemen and all the other groups that Simon mentioned, they consider them mercenaries or ISIS. They believe in a divine right to rule over Yemenis as descendants of Prophet Muhammad. So either you accept them or you're the enemy. And again, now they're threatening the last stronghold of the Yemeni government, and they're not willing to de-escalate despite so many calls by, basically the entire diplomatic community. So a power share under the current circumstances, in my opinion, will not bring peace. It will only seal Houthis' military victory with a political recognition, further complicating Yemen conflict. So if I want to say something, I want to say that the UN and international, the power share initiatives by the UN and the international community in the past, and so far have only helped reinforce the traditional dynamics, military and political dynamics, and exacerbated the conflict as a result. So the question is, not only is Yemen ready for a power share, but also can Yemen afford another elite-centric power share, which I think what is now on the table. Thank you. I'll just leave it at that, and I'll be happy to answer your questions.
Thank you very much indeed. That's another dimension, I think, that begs a heck of a lot of quite fundamental questions, really, about how we might approach the situation. Next contributor we've got is Maysaa, and I'd ask you to speak for about 8 minutes as well, too, if you could, please. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this. I will second on Nadwa that the sectarian division is not the core of the Yemeni conflict. First of all, the sectarian division in Yemen, it is regional tribal division in its first level. So when we are talking about Zaidi in Yemen, it means almost he is from the north of Sanaa, actually. So it doesn't mean something sectarian, because the differences between the Sunni and the Zaidis in practice and jurisprudence are just few, are not very important and major. The only difference is it is the political theory of imama for the Zaidis, and the Zaidi imama that is justifying the rebellion against the ruler, which explained the Houthi behavior. And it's also restrict this ruling for the descendants of the Prophet who's named in Yemen, the Hashemites. So this is the main distinguishing, and it is a political one. And the Zaydis, actually there was a Zaydi hegemony in Yemen for centuries. So the perspective that the Houthis, they are victims or marginalized, it's not true. If we are going to talk about marginalization, about victimhood, so we are going to talk about the Yemenis in the West, on the East, not about the Yemenis in the North, actually. So I think the sectarian, still the sectarian identity is not, most of the Yemenis didn't recognize the sectarian division, actually. Because of that, most of the warring parties, they are using two discourses in this war. For example, the Salafis and the Brotherhood, they are using the discourse, the religious discourse for their circles, for the insiders. But for the public, they are using the idea that we are defending the Republic against Imama, which is the Houthis. And for the Houthis, they are using also the religious discourse for the insider, for their circle. But for the public, they are using another discourse, which is that we are the Yemeni party that are defending Yemen from external enemies from the Saudis. So this means that they know, both of them, that the sectarian discourse never wins in Yemen, and it's not attractive for most of the Yemenis. So, and also the division between Yemenis is about politics, about region, more than it is about sectarian. But I can't ignore that the sectarian power is supported by the regional powers outside of Yemen, which make them big, which make them very effective, very powerful on the ground, military-wise, but not politically-wise. About sharing power, Yemen has many failed attempts of sharing power. It failed in the 90s, and it led to civil war in 1994. It failed in 2011 and it led to civil war again. So the idea is not a magic. Yeah, many people talk about sharing power as if it's a magic and everything will be fine. It's not. This is the case with the Yemenis. They have many experience of failed sharing power between themselves. I believe the war, this war, it's very difficult to share power. First of all, there's imbalance of power between the different warring parties. The Houthis is overconfident. And actually the Saudis and their Yemeni allies lose the war. And they can't shift the trajectory of the war to their behalf, except they win the southern territories. More than this, they can't do anything more. So the Houthis now, they are behaving on their areas as a de facto power, de facto ruler. They are changing the educational curriculum. They are spreading their ideology. They are forcing their social code. For example, the woman should wear this and don't wear that, and separation between women and men. So I don't think this attitude means that they are going or they are willing to share power. They are feeling they are very comfortable with this war. The war gives them the legitimacy that they need. And it equipped them from the people demands. I mean, the Houthis, they collect last year, according to the UN report, they collect more than $1.5 billion taxes from the people. In return, they didn't provide any service. They didn't provide any salaries because they are fighting and everything is going to the war. So what will drive the Houthis to the negotiation and to share power? This is the question. And I have to say, one of the things that make sharing power in Yemen always is not a good idea. It is the disregarding of the idea of the local governance. We always dismiss this idea. It is very important because the successful models in Yemen now, or the stable areas in Yemen, they are local governance models. In Marib, in Shabwa, in Hadramaut, all of them, they were ruled by local actors because those local actors are in contact with the society day by day. They have a personal relationship with the society. It's something different than when you come from Riyadh and control the people and your family in Riyadh, for example, and you don't care actually, because in the local governance, if they are local actor, I can't provide something to my home. I can't provide service without providing this service for all the community. The same thing goes with the Houthis. They are now the Houthis, they built parallel system to the state institution. And this system, we are talking about thousands of supervisors. Those people, where are they going if the war ends and we say that we told to the Houthis, okay, you have to dismiss all of these thousands of people who are now controlling the country, take money from the people and do whatever they want, and they are immune actually. It's very difficult to think about these details. Now those supervisors, this network of supervisors, they are controlling everything, and 90% of them, they are from Sanaa. And they don't understand the mentality of most of the local communities in Yemen, and they don't care about these communities because they are from totally different area, from isolated tribal governorate, from a very marginalized governorate. And when they are dealing with cities, big cities like Al-Hudaydah, like Sanaa, or when they are dealing with totally different society in Eb, it's another story. Also, we have to understand that the Houthis inherited the state institutions, the state capabilities of Yemen, because it was a very centralized state in Sanaa. Adding to this, they are very organized, they are well structured. So I doubt, and they have their vision, whether we are agreeing with this vision or we are not, but they have a clear vision and they want to apply this vision to the society. And they are starting this. They start already this. So how we can change all of this? They don't have any incentive to end the war. We don't have, they are overconfident and they are expanding military actually to Marib. So I really doubt that this war can be ended. It can be ended on its regional level. Like the Houthis can compromise with the Saudis. I don't think they have a really problem with the Saudis, but on the local level, it's very difficult. And thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed. Again, I think that that poses many questions. I mean, if you don't think that the agenda, as we've tried to set it out, is not really realistic, then what is the alternative, and what sort of agenda do we need to be exploring? Thank you very much indeed. Kate, last but by no means least, can you make your contribution, please? 7 to 8 minutes.
Sure, thank you very much. So my work over the last 12 years or so has been primarily focused on conflict prevention and peace building efforts happening at the community level in Yemen, as well as working in particular with women's groups and youth groups. So I'm going to talk a bit less about those kind of formal power sharing models, although I share a lot of Nadwa and Maysaa's skepticism, and a little bit more about those kind of community relationships that are such an important element of building sustainable peace through any model, that kind of more bottom-up thing that Simon was talking about. More recently, I've also been working on some new research with a couple of colleagues from the Yemen Policy Centre. You can see that Yazid's on the call, on the role of creative arts in peace building. So if I have time, I'm going to talk a tiny bit about that as well. So the war in Yemen has exacerbated pre-existing social, political, geographic, and religious divisions and created new ones. But as Maysaa was saying, historically, religious differences have been of limited importance to people in Yemen, and sectarianism is really not ever been a driver of conflict or a mobilizing frame for violence in Yemen. It's much more of an overlap of geographic identities, political identities. However, what we are seeing is a rise in religious and sectarian rhetoric, not just from prominent national voices, but also in the everyday lives of Yemenis. So stereotyping of each other based on last name or where you come from. So you see, oh, you're from this area, you must be pro-Hadi. Oh, your last name is this, you must be pro-Houthi. So that's sort of bubbling away at a community level. Although it's very much political differences feeding this sectarianism and not vice versa. It's also being this sectarian rhetoric is being deliberately manipulated and spread as part of the war tactics of various conflict actors, but particularly the Houthis, through schools, through mosques, through local TV shows, through local radio, and through social media. However, at Yemen Polling Centre, we talk to Yemenis all over the country, and religious differences are still really not playing any role in driving local conflict. What's causing unrest in most communities is the lack of availability of food, of fuel, of medicine, lack of jobs, land disputes, and housing. Really not these kind of religious differences that get talked about at this sort of fancy academic level. So I work a lot with civil society, and these growing political and social divisions are also affecting civil society and activist groups in Yemen, who in my opinion are one of the cornerstones to building peace in Yemen in the long term. So it's increasingly difficult for civil society actors to move around the country, to meet with other activists. It's really difficult to produce any work or do any work without being labelled as serving the agenda of a particular conflict actor. And even in Sanaa at the moment, even using the word peace arouses suspicion and can bring you huge amounts of problems from the local Houthi authorities. Really love that Maysaa mentioned women. Obviously going to talk a tiny bit about women. Local conflict actors, the Houthis in particular, but other actors as well, are manipulating traditional and religious gender norms to further prevent women's participation and attack women who seem to step out of line. So there's as Maysaa mentioned, enforcement of more regressive norms around dress codes and women's visibility, using issues like mixed gender attendance at a meeting as a pretext to shut things down, which is a really problematic thing for civil society. And I really agree with Maysaa there that this is not the actions of groups that are ready for some kind of inclusive power sharing situation. At the same time, violent actions against women that would have been previously considered shameful, like detention and torture of women, have proliferated, sadly, as well as the recruitment. Despite the Houthis, for example, talking about how women shouldn't work, they recruit women into their units as informers that police other women. So what we're seeing is a massively restricted space for civic activism, particularly for young people and for women. However, despite this, we're seeing community groups, youth groups, women's groups continue to come together, particularly at a very local level, and finding spaces and ways of working towards peace. And it's things like spearheading local humanitarian interventions in spaces that others, particularly internationals, cannot reach. Often assuming the roles of like what should be state or public institutions, like providing education centers, health centers, distributing food and water. They're organizing the community. Often you'll find women and youth groups organizing local talks and discussions and negotiations. And also you find a lot of women's groups in particular providing psychosocial support for vulnerable children and adults in their area. And for me, it's really at this level of kind of community engagement where a great deal of the opportunities lie for laying the groundwork for peace. So I think I've got a minute or two left. So I'm just going to say a tiny bit about I realize it seems a little off topic, but I promise you it's not. My work on arts and peace building. So me and my colleagues Yazid and who's on the call and Majid, we've been talking to artists and peace builders in lots of different areas of Yemen. And what we're seeing is that some of the biggest opportunities for peace building and rebuilding social cohesion really is like about recognizing the different types of activities that can ultimately contribute to this. And arts, the creative arts are a really, really important part of that. So creative arts are often seen as soft. They're often soft, particularly when we're talking about power sharing. They're often small in scale, but actually they're potentially better placed than formal processes to deal with the complexity of conflict, the messiness of conflict, and also the emotional content of conflict that we often don't really talk about. Also helps us thinking about creative arts, so painting, writing, storytelling, theatre, music, comedy. It helps us broaden out our thinking about what peace building efforts can look like away from that kind of traditional focus on institution building and like military and political arrangements and those top-down negotiation frameworks, and actually a space for something that could be much more inclusive. So just briefly, what we've managed to find is all sorts of arts and cultural activities that are happening in Yemen, despite all of the difficulties and the difficulties around freedom of expression in Yemen at the moment. So you've got pop stars making music videos about tolerance and not using sectarian language. You've got women's organizations in places like Marib using traditional forms of poetry to do campaigns against child recruitment. You've got theatre and comedy performances in places like Taiz and McCullough that are bringing communities together and bringing communities together in a kind of joy. And even in Sanaa, where the restrictions from the Houthi authorities are probably the harshest for trying to do arts, there's still people bringing young women together to learn the violin. And while they're not going to be able to perform publicly right now, there's a real sense of this is an important part of what we want our Yemeni future to be. So my friend and colleague, Atiaf Al-Wazir, she says that dealing with violent conflict is essentially about dealing with brokenness. So a brokenness of society, a brokenness of community, and a brokenness of individuals, which often just doesn't get talked about when we're talking about these kind of formal arrangements to bring men with guns to the table. And arts and cultural activities, we're finding can really provide that kind of essential space for society to begin to mend.
Right, well, thank you very much indeed. That's a very, very different take on what we've had so far, but nevertheless a very, very worthwhile contribution, I think, to the discussion. Now, we come to the other interesting part of our seminar. Now, I have to say there's a heck of a lot of comments in the chat, but very few questions there, but nevertheless extremely worthwhile comments, which people clearly feel very, very strongly about. But I've got a number of questions which have been submitted. And I think the first one is probably for me. So if you don't mind, I'll deal with that one quickly. It's about the announcement of the British government is reducing its aid to Yemen by nearly 50%. And what is my response to that? Well, I think there's an extremely retrograde step taken by the Boris Johnson government. I think at a crucial time in the Yemen situation, facing, as Simon has said, the world's worst humanitarian crisis, it's reprehensible, I think, but the British government, one of the largest aid donors, has decided to reduce support by 50%. And I think that sends out a very, very negative message about the moral priorities of the government in Britain. But also, I think that it makes it that much more difficult, really, to move towards a ceasefire and some kind of peace arrangement. So that's my position on that. I'm absolutely against it and quite disgusted by what the British government has decided to do. But if I could just make another comment. I mean, much of my personal experience as a young man was witnessing what had happened in Northern Ireland. And I know people have made the comments about it's perhaps not right and proper to make European comparisons to the situation is in the Middle East and Yemen in particular. But nevertheless, I think that the situation in Northern Ireland is worth looking at just for a moment, because there you had a situation where you had 600-700 years of conflict between two communities. And I think that the feeling was after the outbreak of relatively recent violence, that it was not possible for any one side to gain victory, either the British state or the Irish nationalists. And in a sense, there's something of a historic compromise, because Northern Ireland has got a great deal of autonomy and a real relationship with Southern Ireland, which it didn't have before. But at the same time, the nationalist community in the north put to one side, at least for the foreseeable future, their idea of a united Ireland. So there was a compromise, really, a historic compromise between the two main protagonists there. And that created the space for some kind of civil engagement, really, to work and construct peaceful relationships and break down the historic sectarian divides. But from what I've heard from you today, the situation in Yemen is very, very different and far more complicated even than the situation in Northern Ireland. So the question I want to ask is one which has been suggested by a number of contributors, is that if, as we've been saying for some time, it's not possible to have a military solution, a military victory by one side, but nevertheless the impression I get is that the Houthis clearly believe that it's possible for them to win the war. And unless we move toward acceptance of stalemate, there's no real chance for a ceasefire and moving on from that ceasefire to peaceful developments. So my question, first of all, is that do we think it's really possible for the international community, and Biden in particular, to exercise real influence, not just with the Saudi coalition, but over the Houthis, for them to recognize that victory is not possible? do we think it's necessary to get to that situation first? I think possibly it does. There needs to be that military stalemate before we can talk about other developments. So my question is, do you agree with that? Who'd like to venture an answer? Nadwa?
I can take that. Yeah, I can take that. I don't think, under the current circumstances, I don't think diplomacy will work. Again, because Houthis believe that they have the upper hand militarily, and they do, and they continue to expand, and they want to take Marib, and if they take Marib, they'll venture south, and they'll try to retake Aden as well. So Biden lost the one leverage that he could have used on the Houthis, revoking the designation, the FTO designation. He could have used that as a leverage to at least get the Houthis to, give some concessions. But he lost that leverage. And the way he revoked the resignation, in fact, showed that he is too desperate to come to any form of agreement with the Houthis. And that emboldened them. So the second day after he revoked the designation, they launched a massive offensive to take Marib city, which is again the last stronghold of the government, and they're now threatening the city. So I don't think that the Biden administration, got off the, right foot on this. I mean, realistically speaking, in order for a political solution to happen, the Houthis have to be weakened militarily. Now, can they be weakened militarily? Yes, if there is like a military strategy, and if the UN stop asking the Saudis and the Yemeni government to de-escalate in Marib, because they need to be pushed away, far away from Marib, where Marib, the last stronghold of the government, is safe, and where they feel weak enough to come to the table and agree with others. But right now, they don't feel the need. They don't feel, they don't feel that kind of pain. So they're not going to agree. But there is, I think, most probably that will not happen, given the trajectory and the way the Saudis and the Yemeni government have completely mismanaged this war. So what can be done meanwhile? I think one thing, what should not be done is a political deal that will make matters worse. In my opinion, a no deal is better than a bad deal. And we've seen how in Yemen, bad deals just made things much more complicated and much worse. So what could happen is look at pockets of stability and try to promote these pockets of stability. Houthis only control 30% of the geography. There is 70% of the geography that's under the control of various actors. Some are aligned with the government, some are against the government, but they're relatively stable. And so one thing has to happen. One, try to bring these all anti-Houthi forces together politically. Two, try to support stability in these areas. So, promote local economy, local security, infrastructure, kind of stabilize these areas. And over time, hopefully that will raise demand for peace in other places. And look, this is a very difficult conflict and very complicated. And I think to ask for Yemen to be back a one country under a central government is also extremely ambitious. And so we have to keep our expectations, we have to keep our expectations low. And Yemen conflict is just like any other conflict. It will run its course. And all we can do right now is to mitigate the impact of the conflict. The UN envoy can work with the parties to try to open roads, seaports, airports, pay the salaries for people and government employees in Houthi controlled areas. All these arrangements that will help at least mitigate the impact of the conflict on ordinary Yemenis, while there is no an end to the conflict. So various things can happen. And Kate, she gave an excellent presentation. Absolutely agree with her. Civil society, not only, in my opinion, the silver lining in this conflict is civil society. They have evolved and grew so much during the conflict because they're not dependent on the donors. They found themselves, in a situation where there is war. Donors have withdrawn, and their communities had needs and they responded to their communities' needs. And I think that's absolutely fascinating. And one day it will materialize, you know, in a much larger scale. So.
Well, thanks very much for that. Would anybody else like to come in? Simon?
Yeah, thanks. I echo everything that Nadwa was saying, and also just to advocate for that softer approach that Kate was talking so powerfully and wonderfully about with music and art. I think it's so powerful and so very important for actually transforming the way that people view one another. And that's fundamentally what conflict's about, the perception of the other, and how the baggage that comes with that is viewed in positive or negative ways. So anything that can help break down some of those tensions. And as a former violin player myself, Kate, I was pleased to hear that that the violin is being taught. But just to build on what Nadwa was saying, that there has been this this relationship between the Hadi government and the STC recently in the past few months, which, as far as I'm aware, seems to be holding, maybe to the surprise of a few, but I think that maybe tells you something about the fear of the Houthis. But I guess there's a degree of a precarious relationship between the government, the STC, and the various other groups that exert influence in Yemen, which is what makes all of this so very difficult, to get to a point where the Houthis are pushed to a position where they're weak enough to feel that they have to negotiate. But all of this is playing out sort of at an elite level, sort of top-down level, where it's the civil society, it's the people of Yemen who are paying the heaviest of prices in the face of competition between strongman and strongman, and it's devastating. And to think that global Britain decides to cut its funding and its aid at a time when all of this is happening is, I'll say a slightly stronger word, it's abhorrent.
I would certainly agree with the use of that word, absolutely. And could I also say, I play the oboe as well too, Kate. So there's something else which potentially unites us. Kate, did you want to say something?
Have zero artistic capabilities.
Did you want to say something to expand upon your view, which seems to have some resonance amongst the other participants?
Yeah, I agree very much with what Nadwa was saying, but I think we're not looking. So what Yemenis need absolutely is a cessation of the violence, 100%. However, they also need an awful lot of other things in order to be able to live safe and secure lives. So there needs to be a resumption of basic services. There needs to be a resumption of salaries to public sector workers. And this stuff can happen and can start happening now. And I really worry, as much as I want to see an inclusive peace agreement, I really worry that we put off working on other things whilst we're waiting for this ephemeral elite agreement, that even if it happens, even if we have some kind of signed agreement between 1, 2, 3 of the conflict groups, we're still going to see conflict, unfortunately, play out at a local level in Yemen for a long time. The idea of essential states of any kind in Yemen, I think, is a bit, as much as we may want, some of us may want that, I think it's somewhat illusory and a bit of a red herring, when what we need to be doing is making sure people have food, they have water, they have healthcare, particularly when we're in a global pandemic.
Well, thanks for that. I mean, I think we'd all agree, but to achieve a ceasefire is of tremendous importance. Can I ask you just a question about how that might come about? Because Biden has a strategy. He's concerned about the humanitarian crisis, but he's also concerned about establishing some kind of peace, at least in the short term, to create a political space. And one of the things that he's exploring, I understand, is a new relationship between the US and Iran. And Iran has got some influence. It's debatable how much, but it has some influence over the Houthis. Do you think there's any mileage for the United States to pursue a pressure on the Houthis via Iran, or do you think that's a non-starter? Maysaa?
Yeah, I think there is an Iranian influence on the Houthis, and it increased during the war. It wasn't that big, but during the war, it increased. It has been increased. And the Iranian, I think they look to the Houthis as a cheap card. They don't cost them anything, actually, but they want from them a lot because they're exhausting the Saudis, and the conflict in Yemen is very far from Iran. So any implication of this conflict will not affect Iran in any time. So they can keep gambling as much as they can in Yemen without feeling of any threat or any problem in continuing this war or this conflict in Yemen. And this is a really dilemma because for the Saudis, Yemen, they share a long borders with the Yemenis, and it is an essential thing for them, and they believe that they can't accept the Iranian influence on their southern borders. At the same time, the Iranian, they don't care, or they don't feel that they are under any pressure to stop this war. But if we say that there is a kind of agreement, and this agreement between the US and Iran involves some regional issues like Yemen war, so the Iranian concede and present some concessions on the Yemeni file and return something else. Okay, I can say that it could help, but we have to not underestimate, we should not underestimate the historical legacy of the Houthis. The Houthis believe that they are the true rulers or the only legitimate rulers for the Yemen, especially north of Yemen, because we are talking about a historical legacy of Zaidi Imama. It continued for centuries in this area. So because of that, the Houthis, it's very difficult for them to concede for a long time. And through the negotiation with the Houthis, and many times, what we noticed that the Houthis, their demands are moving. Sometimes it's there, it's very high. Sometimes it's very low. It depends to their military position. So they always rely on their military position, and they always say something and do something because actually they believe that they are the real rulers of Yemen. At the same time, they feel that they have to show a kind of concessions. And I have to comment something about your first input, about previous input, about the Houthis did not win the war or something, that there is no victory in this war. For the militia, Houthi, they are militia. So for them, the meaning of victory is totally different than the Saudis. The Saudis are state, and they have some international engagement, and for them, definitely victory is a totally different definition for the militia. For the militia, just keeping existing, it is a victory. We're still alive, it is a victory. Whatever the situation of the country, but it is for them, this is victory. And they believe that they are the winner party, regardless to the situation of the country. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. I mean, that's an interesting point you're making about what is the goal of the different actors in it. One of the things which struck me, however, is that Yemen has had a very centralized government, hasn't it, over the last few years. I mean, are we correct in talking about Yemen as though it has to be some sort of unitary state? Maybe it's more realistic to talk about a federation or a decentralized
Yeah,
amalgam
I totally agree.
of confederation. I mean,
yeah,
perhaps we need to rethink really what our assumptions are about the future of Yemen.
yeah.
Exactly.
Would you agree with that,
Yeah,
Nadwa?
definitely. It must be.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Continue, Nadwa.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think I agree, and Maysaa is also a champion of this. You know, the international community are so desperate to bring a central government to function to run the country from Sanaa, but that's just not plausible. I don't think it's plausible now. I don't think it's going to be plausible 10 years from now. I think the one government ruling in the entire country, even with a decentralized version of governance, is also far-fetched, given, you know, how this conflict evolved. I think we will see several Yemens probably connecting with each other somehow. But I agree with Maysaa, and I agree with you. I think the way forward to go is to focus on bottom-up, decentralized, and not to have to connect it to like a national level. One of the things that frustrate me with every donor these days is that they want to implement projects on security or economy, but they want to link it to the peace process. Why does it have to be linked to the peace process? I don't know. And I think that's just a, you know, a flaw. Yeah, I agree with you.
Yeah. Kate, did you indicate that you wanted to?
Yeah, well, I guess I sort of already answered that in agreement with Nadwa and Maysaa. You can tell we've worked together for a long time. But yeah, I think it's not just that it's not feasible, but it's also distracting us from doing that bottom-up work. And I think that it's actually quite problematic to still be talking about a centralized Yemen state when what we should be talking about is the welfare and well-being of Yemeni citizens. And currently there is not going to be any state that can provide that, centralized state that can provide that. However, I would put a caveat, and I haven't really thought this through, but in our fragmented, in our fragmented Yemeni state, whatever that might look like, I do then really, really worry about this, the citizens and civil society that end up in a particularly repressive area with particularly repressive authorities, such as the Houthis, but the Houthis are not the only authorities that have some of those inclinations. So, and like what happens there? Like, do we just, you know, talk to the Marabis because it'll all be okay in Marib? What about the Yemenis that are being oppressed?
You pose a question there. Simon, would you like to try and respond to Kate's question? What do you do about people who find themselves under an extremely repressive regime?
No, I don't think that I'm the right person to talk about that, because I have nothing positive to say, unfortunately, about it, and I don't want to take away from that, which I think is really important, and maybe leave it to Nadwa, Kate, or Maysaa. But I just wanted to come back to your question about the state. This sort of fetishization of the Yemeni state seems so inappropriate when we think about the very purpose of a state. The purpose of a state is to provide for its people and to ensure that people have the protection, the care, the welfare, the institutional support that they need. Going back to Ibn Khaldun, he talks about politics being the survival of the species. So in the contemporary context, the state is the vehicle through which the citizens or the people residing within a particular territory are protected. Their survival is ensured. But in the case of Yemen, the state isn't doing any of that. So to go back to this fetishized model of a state that doesn't meet any of the criteria of what we would typically identify when talking about a state seems to be absolutely inappropriate, misguided, and perhaps reflects, I don't know, be it Western centricity of the importance of states and the Westphalian model of statehood, or dare I say the power of the donor community and its ability to make money. I don't know. Just a couple of thoughts.
I personally think that there's a big challenge there, really, for Western politicians, because I admit that we tend to talk about Yemen, and the assumption is that we're talking about one unitary identity. And we need to have a rethink, really. And as a consequence of that, perhaps Western states and the United Nations itself needs to slightly rethink how it might develop an agenda for the future.
Mm.
Yeah.
Can I answer, Kate?
Yes, please.
About a question. About Marib, why all the people concerned about Marib are not concerned about the people who are under the Houthi-controlled area. I have to say the Houthi, they are controlling now the Zaidi area. And the Zaidi area always subjected to any government coming from Sanaa, any ruler from Sanaa. They are easily subjected to them. They face some rebellion, tribal rebellion there and here and there, but nothing can be serious will threaten them there. And this area is tribal area actually, and its connection with the state historically wise, it's always weak. And the other area, which is the non-Zaidi area, they are the Hudaydah. It is Al-Hudaydah and Eb mainly. They are two, and most of taxes are coming, and most of the revenues actually, and the economic revenues coming from those two cities actually. Because if the Houthis, they want to punish one of their supervisors, they will send them to Jawf or whatever in this remote area in the Zaidi tribal areas. If they want to reward him, they will send him to Eb or Al-Hudaydah so he can find a lot of money to collect from the people. These areas are actually historically wise, they are not tribal, socially wise, they are not tribal areas. The people are very peaceful and they are easily subjected to the Sanaa government. But in Eb, actually historically wise, Eb was always independent from the state in Sanaa most of the time. And it is a tribal area, which is very difficult to accept the Houthi. The Houthis can take Marib, military-wise, they can't take Marib, but they can't control it. They can't control it like they are controlling Sanaa now, they are controlling Eb now. They can't control Marib. It's very difficult to control Marib. So the problem here that the people will be resentment, there is a resentment among the people will be raised from against the Houthis in Marib, and this will radicalize the community against them. This will make some Sunni radical movement very attractive for the people there to express their feeling of resentment. And it's important to understand that we are sacrificing one of the few stable areas in Yemen that is hosting 2 million internal displaced people, half of them in camps. So this is the danger from taking over Marib by the Houthis. Thank you.
It's a slightly, some would say a pessimistic scenario, but I mean, some people have suggested that as the Houthis militarily appear to have the upper hand, they could take Marib. And some people are saying, well, that is one way to end the war. But other people have said, I know, but if Marib were taken by the Houthis, there'd be an escalation of the humanitarian crisis, with many people evacuating the city and basically going out into the desert. The situation would be humanitarianly much, much worse.
Marib is also home to a very large number of people that have already been displaced from other areas of Yemen.
But not only humanitarian, though. I mean, the humanitarian aspect, of course, the impact will be devastating because you have 2 million, IDPs plus, another million civilians who relocated to the governorate. But at the same time, if Houthis take Marib, like Maysaa explained, when Houthis enter an area like that, when Houthis enter areas, what they do, they blow up homes, they execute tribal leaders, and they're very repressive. And there's already a huge resentment against the Houthis in Marib because these guys have been defending their governorate for 5 years, 6 years now, and they've lost thousands. And so they're not going to go, they're not going to just surrender to the Houthis. They might make agreement with some tribal leaders, but the majority of the people will not accept that. They've lost so much. And so there will be insurgency against them. And as Maysaa explained, some radical groups might offer a venue for them to fight the Houthis. I mean, it's the enemy of my enemy, not because people are radical, but they would be very frustrated and very helpless that would be their only option. And that will destabilize one of the, if not the most stable area in Yemen that hosts millions of civilians. But not only that, if Houthis take Marib, they'll move to Shabwa, they'll move to Hadramaut. These are oil-rich governorates, again, relatively stable in the south. And that will give them revenues to continue their wars and retake Aden. So it will be disastrous in terms of the scale of the violence that will emerge, because if they take Marib, it would be much worse than the stalemate we're in right now.
Yeah.
I have to add to Nadwa that the Houthis reached their maximum of capacity as rulers, actually, because they are a minor group by the end of the day. And they didn't, and they refused to include a lot of people from outside of their core, because they are suspecting everyone and they don't trust the people easily. So it's very difficult for them to expand the ruling outside of their areas now. And they will face many, many problems in controlling these communities. Thank you.
I mean, could I ask a question about the Houthis? I mean, many of you are extremely critical of the nature of their movement, as it were. But I mean, it is very much a militia-based ad hoc amalgam of different groups, as I understand it. I mean, are there any elements which have different views within Houthis, or are they all of singular one mind? What I'm thinking of, is it possible for negotiations to take place with some elements in the Houthi alliance, or is it very, very difficult with all of them?
I will say this. Actually, the problem with the Houthis is that they are a movement that emerged from war, through war. And they are fighting for 17 years now. They are fighting since 2004. So we are talking about people who start fighting when they were teenagers, when they were children, like Abdul Malik al-Houthi himself. So they used to fight. This is one of the really, really big problems. And I believe that nothing will make the Houthis more pragmatic and more than being in power, relaxed, without war. So they will lose one of their advantages. But now they used to fight. And this is one of the problems, that this is a fighting group in its core. And this makes them very, ideologically, they are very strict and very close-minded. They are coming from mountains. Big part of them, they never see the sea. When they go to Aden, one of their problems that for the first time they saw sea. They saw coast and beach. So most of them, they are coming from very remote and isolated areas. And we have to understand this mentality is very difficult to deal with. And it may take time. I believe it will take time.
And people talk also, I would add to Maysaa, people talk about Houthi moderates, and there are a few Houthis who are very attractive. If you sit with them and discuss with them, they're very smart, very intelligent, very articulate, but they're not the ones who are calling the shots. They're only a facade of, talk to outside actors, but the people who own the decision-making are ideologues, the radicals. In fact, these were the people who celebrated the FTO designation. They take, sanctions, they wear sanctions as badges of honor. That kind of mentality, I mean, and I'm citing their own materials, media, propaganda, their leaders, statements. They are on a holy war. They're on a holy war. And their stated objective is not only liberating all of Yemen, but also going beyond Yemen, liberating Mecca and Jerusalem. I mean, and I go back to Iran, and Iran did such an intelligent work with the Houthis, really smart, little investment, but long-term impact. Iran does not control the Houthis. It doesn't have much influence on the Houthis. It's a partnership, but it's also a shared commitment. And so it's really hard to reason with that.
Can I move a discussion in the last few minutes slightly onwards? And there's a big debate, and it's been raised by a number of people in the chat about the arms trade and the fact that Britain does supply a large amount of arms to Saudi Arabia in particular. And there's been a lot of criticism of the British government for doing that. I think the United States has had at least a short-term arms embargo on Saudi Arabia. Is that of any significance? And what do you think the British government should do to try and help the situation? Who'd like to be first, Simon?
Do you want me to say that as a British activist on this, or would you rather give a Yemeni?
Well, yes, I mean, Simon could come in and then perhaps Kate.
Well, maybe Kate first, given that I think she's got a particularly strong view on this that I think is very important.
Yes, it's very much not a view that relates specifically to Yemen, though, so it sort of does, but I'm interested to hear what Nadwa and Maysaa have. But essentially, answering this with my British citizen hat on and my peace activism in the UK hat on, I want to see a complete abolition of the international arms industry. So just to frame it, but what we're seeing is huge amounts of arms going to Saudi for use in Yemen throughout the conflict. So I think since the war began, we've seen 6.8 billion arms licensed, but that doesn't include all of the open issue export licenses. It's a really cautious estimate. So it's huge amounts of money. But it's also worth bearing in mind that it's not just about making the UK money, which is bad enough that we're trying to make money off other people's conflict and misery. We also actually, as a UK government, subsidise this industry hugely. And we could switch those subsidies into things that are good for the world, like renewable energy. So we could transition our jobs in arms manufacturing in the UK over to jobs in renewable energy in the UK. I'm a member of Campaign Against Arms Trade, and some of you will be aware, but Campaign Against Arms Trade have taken the UK government to court on their selling of arms to Saudi because it breaks our own law. And we're currently, it's been a bit of an on-off process, but essentially in last year, the government announced that it had done a review and is going to be resuming arms sales to Saudi, and CAT is taking that to, Campaign Against Arms Trade is taking that to appeal. So on the basis of our own British laws, we are breaking our own laws selling arms to Saudi. However, I would say that this is only one part of what is happening in the Yemen conflict. And I do worry sometimes about the focus that this brings, because we've got such good activism here in the UK on this, but the focus this brings on international humanitarian law violations and human rights violations by the Saudis, which are horrendous, but that also obscures all of the human rights violations by other actors on the ground. So we need to be talking, we talk about Saudi because the UK government are supplying out arms to, that's who we're supplying arms to. We don't really talk about what the UAE are up to, even though we supply arms to the UAE as well. And the UAE have got secret prisons, they're detaining and torturing people. And it does sometimes obscure what can be as big a threat on the ground for many Yemenis from other conflict actors.
Make a number of good points, if I may say.
Can I add to that?
Nadwa?
Yeah, and I really appreciate all the advocacy against arms sale, and it's very important. And as a Yemeni, I would like to see Saudi Arabia exiting Yemen at some point. But there's one thing, I want to say, and Kate mentioned that the ending arms sale to the Saudis is not going to end conflict. That's one thing. But at the same time, it's not also about focusing on human rights violations by the Saudis, but not human rights violations by the Houthis. It's also one thing I know, if airstrikes stopped right now, Houthis will be able to take Marib overnight. So by ending the arms sale under these conditions, are we aiding the Houthis take Marib and then making the conflict in Yemen much worse? I think people need to think about these also unintended consequences when they advocate for for arms sale. I honestly advocate for a more conditional arms sale rather than completely suspend the arms sale under the current circumstances in Yemen, of course, not as a general rule. Thank you.
Yeah. I mean, just specifically on arms sales, I mean, one of the things that the Labour opposition in Britain has been very critical of over the last few weeks is arms sales to Saudi Arabia, not least because of other things which happen in Saudi Arabia as well. But also we're saying there should be far greater scrutiny so that every single contract of Saudi Arabia and other countries is properly scrutinized by Parliament and set aside the country's human rights record and how the arms are being used, which is not the case at the moment. The government basically does what it's like and quite often ignores the law and dances around the courts, which is Kate's point. We're coming towards the end. Maysaa, would you like to say something finally to conclude, and then perhaps we'll finish with Simon where we began?
Yeah, I have to say that ending the war should not be connected to inclusive political solution. First of all, we have to stop the war, ceasefire on the current lines, address the humanitarian issues, address some important issues like Al-Hudaydah and messy situation that happened in this governorate, and also like opening Sanaa airport by the coalition, lift the blockade of Taiz city by the Houthis. Some things that we should put pressure on the warring parties on some issues. But the most thing that we should do, first of all, ceasefire, stop the war now. Then we can talk about some solutions, some political solution based on decentralized state, encouraging local governance, many things we can talk about, maybe dividing Yemen into different countries, whatever, but this war must stop on this front lines now. And the pressure should be on Iran, not the Houthis, because there is nothing to do with the Houthis. When you impose sanctions on Abd al-Malik al-Houthi by the UN, he doesn't have passport, he doesn't have bank account, all of this nonsense. The pressure should be on Iran, Oman. Oman has a good relationship with the Houthis and they facilitate to them a lot of things, and they need Oman always, so they did some job with the Houthis. So the war should stop. The international community can force the Saudis to present some concessions, but this leverage is not easy with the Houthis. So these things should go together. I believe that ceasefire is a must now, then talk about political solutions. It should not be connected. It's not necessary to be connected. It's not necessary to complicate the situation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So that's very, very clear and very helpful, I might say. Simon, did you want to say a few concluding remarks?
Yeah, maybe just a few. I guess what we've all taken out of this is that this is a complex web of interactions of local, national, international grievances, animosity, hatred, and death. And it's the Yemenis, the ordinary Yemeni people that are paying the heaviest price for this. And that has to stop. It shouldn't stop in such a way that tries to go back to a shell of a Yemeni state, because that will not lead to the end of the deaths and the torture and the suffering and the heartache of many Yemenis. Neither will a Houthi takeover of the country. So it's complex. It's that balance between figuring out the best way to stop humanitarian crisis, which may involve using force, but also not using force to such an extent that it causes future humanitarian crises. So it's such a complex web of interactions. But I guess the final thing is, and I say this as a white man living in Lancaster, but it's so important that we hear from Yemenis about these things, and a plurality of Yemeni voices. But I've seen so many events, and I'm proud to say that SEPAD has never done this, ever, and we won't. But we have never had an event on a particular topic pertaining to the Middle East that doesn't feature people from those states, and both covering not only those identities, but also genders as well. We need to hear these different voices. It's a must, and panels that don't reflect local voices is so wrong.
Well said, Simon. And I think our discussion has been very worthwhile. As we know only too well, there are no easy answers to these complexities. But I think having discussions like this takes us a modest step forward. So thank you all very much indeed. And my thanks especially to the Foreign Policy Centre and to SEPAD for facilitating this discussion. Thank you all very much indeed. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.